Story 1. My family owns a huge plot of land full of trees, and on the edge of the property they built a cabin. Compared to the main house, it feels a lot more closed off in the woods. This year I took a trip up there around the end of October to see my parents and siblings. With the house being full, I volunteered to stay at the cabin for the few days I was there. This was the first day I arrived on the property. There wasn't a drivable road to get to the cabin, so I parked at the main house. All I had was a light backpack with my stuff, and I was only really planning on sleeping at the cabin, so I didn't bother making a trip there just to drop my bag off. Around 5 we had one I guess was a small party, as it was the first time in a while that all of us were together. We had some food and drinks and shared updates on our lives. It was a good time, but it definitely wore out my energy after a few hours. I told them I was going to head out to the cabin for the night and get ready for bed, so I threw my backpack on and left through the back door. The trail to get there was very thin. It was about a 10-minute walk. I hadn't even thought about the dark, though. There were no lights or anything along the trail, so I had to put on my phone light just to see where I was stepping. A little ways down, I randomly heard a stick snap behind me. I turned and looked at the path, when my phone light was awful and barely lit up anything. I figured it was nothing and kept walking only a couple seconds. Later, though, I heard it again. It was like as soon as I started walking, something behind me started walking to like I was being followed. Without there, Alec. I know it. You're not funny, bro, I called out, hoping it was just my brother being annoying. I knew if there was him, though, he would have been cracking up by now. I felt really uneasy as the suspense of not being able to see anything really started getting to me. I kept walking, moving faster now. I heard leaves crunch several times. As I continued making my way to the cabin, though, I didn't turn around knowing I wouldn't see anything anyway. I hoped it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I drank a little too much. Whatever it was, I didn't want to be out in the woods any longer, so I hurried and finally made it to the cabin. I unlocked the door and got in, locking it behind me. After tossing my bag on the floor, I rubbed my face out of stress of whatever I just experienced. Then a subtle sound came from the other side of the door. It was someone turning the knob and trying to open it, and right after they figured out it was locked, they banged on. And not just like full on hitting the door. I almost fell over just from the jump scare of it. They kept banging on the door, though, in with nothing else to do. I walked up and looked out the thin window on the side of the door to see who it was. When I did, I saw a man wearing a dark jacket and heavy boots that I'd never seen before in my life. I only looked for a moment before his eyes shot over at me. They were full of rage, and he immediately followed up by pounding on the window. Then out of nowhere, a voice yelled from the woods. The man paused, then sprinted in the opposite direction. About 30 seconds later, I checked out the window and saw my brother Alex running up to the cabin. I guess he happened to see the guy come up behind me as they started walking to the cabin, and after asking my parents if they knew him, he immediately came running for me. To this day, we've never seen him again and don't know what he was doing out in the woods on our property, or why he was stalking me that night still scares the hell out of me to think about, though. Story 2. This was in 2016. My parents had just moved to the West Coast, and I was on my way driving there to visit them. A lot of the way there is pretty empty, with only a few gas stations spread out down the long highway. At some point during my second night of driving, my check engine light came on in my car. I wasn't exactly surprised because my car was old enough, very reliable, but I wasn't really a car person either. and I had no clue what could be going on with it. I looked up where the next gas station was. It was another 30 miles away, but I really had no choice but to make it there. However, my car decided to make the choice for me. Instead, though, as the engine suddenly cut out, leaving me coasting along the side of the road until I eventually stopped. I tried everything I could to get it working again. I even got out and looked under the hood for any possible causes of the problem, but I saw nothing. Honestly, I thought this was just the final leg of my car. In the meantime, all I could do was find a way to get help. I pulled my phone out and I immediately felt my stomach drop as I had no service. I tried a few calls anyway, but obviously none of them went through. After 30 minutes of trying to find a solution, I realized I really only had one option, which was to hitchhike a ride. I'd never done it before, and I was kind of nervous, not really knowing what to expect. I always found it as a strange thing that I never thought I'd ever do. I stood out there on the side of the road and just waited. Every 15 or so minutes, a single car would pass by, but none of them stopped for me. This went on for hours. It was probably 2 or 3 a.m. For I saw the headlights have another car coming down the road. I stuck my thumb out, assuming it would pass by like all the rest, but to my surprise, they started pulling over. It was a black pickup truck, and I couldn't really see the driver until I walked around to the side of their car. He was a very skinny man with a long, thin face, and matched with his long black hair, it was a little unsettling. "Need a left," he said happily with a big grin. Something really put me off about this guy, but honestly, I was tired and this might be my only opportunity to get a ride, so I didn't pass it off. I hopped in the back seat. I felt like it would have been awkward if we didn't have some small talk, so I asked him what he was up to tonight. "Just cruising on the highway." He responded like it was a hobby of his or something, which was kind of strange since we were in the middle of nowhere. I was surprised. He didn't ask me what I was up to or why I needed a ride, but I tried to think of another question, just to keep the conversation going, the man interrupting my train of thought, though, when he looked at me for a few seconds in the mirror. "You don't have any weapons on you, right? Just making sure I'm safe," he said with again that odd smile of his. I said no, thinking it was a strange question to bluntly ask, but maybe he really was just trying to watch out for himself. I don't know, but after that I stopped talking. 10 more minutes went by as I just stared out the window before the man made a sudden turn off the highway and onto a dirt road. I immediately sat up and looked around, realizing this was definitely not right. "Where are we going?" He shot a quick look at me, then continued to drive without answering. I asked him again more loudly as the heat was building up. "Where are you taking me?" At this point, I knew that no matter what, the next time this car stops, I was going to bolt. So I got ready with my hand on the door. As he drove down this beaten dirt road, suddenly, a small farmhouse appeared in the dim lights. Its front door was wide open, and the whole place looked like he was decaying and falling in on itself. Once we got up closer, he suddenly slammed on the brakes. I jolted forward into the seat, and the man instantly swung his door open and ran around to the side door. I swung mine open as well and sprinted out, heading right for the tree line. Story 3. I was driving back from my friend's place in Wisconsin. I live right outside of Chicago, which is about a 6-hour drive, so I decided to do it all in one go. However, I didn't anticipate leaving so late. I wasn't on the road until 8 p.m., but I absolutely had to be home for work the following day, so there was no option to hang out any longer. If you aren't familiar with Wisconsin, it's mostly flat with a ton of forests all over the northern parts and small towns. Scattered throughout the biggest cities or closer to the border, nowhere near. Where I was, my buddy's place was in one of these small towns, so pretty much right out of the game. AIDS, it was barren forest roads. There were a few cars here and there by once. I was 30 minutes out and the sun had set. There wasn't a single other car. I probably went a whole 2 hours without seeing anyone else on the road. The endless flat for us on either side of me was so repetitive that it was making me sleepy. It definitely didn't help that I was so tired from hanging with my friend all weekend either. I was trying everything to stay awake. But just around 11 p.m. I actually saw something up the road. I opened my eyes. A bit wider in patella was a person. They were standing on the shoulder and had their thumb out, clearly looking for a ride. For some reason, the very first thought that came through my mind was that having company in the car would surely help keep me awake. I almost instinctively began slowing down, and as I got closer, they started walking down the shoulder toward my car. I rolled the window down and pulled up next to them. "Hey, I just need a ride into the next town if you've got a spare seat for me." It was really dark out and I couldn't see much of him, but he sounded tired. I let him into the back seat. It wasn't until I started pulling away that the thought even popped into my head about why he was out here. I mean, the middle of the woods in the middle of the night was kind of a weird place to be. I looked in the mirror. The guy was looking at me through the shadow that covered the back seat. He looked like he was 30-ish with stubble and a buzz cut, but I didn't see a backpack or anything with him. "So what brought you out here?" he asked me. I told him I was at my friend's place for the weekend, was heading back home to Chicago. Then I asked him the same question. His straight face turned into a fake smile. "Oh, I was just walking on a trail in the woods and got lost along the way, found the road. Figured it back to catch a ride." I thought about his answer for a second. I didn't know about any trails or really anything at all these parts of the woods body. Even if there was, he would have had to drive to get here. Why didn't he mention that? Wouldn't he want me to take him to the trailhead instead of into town? I don't know. I was more awake and aware now, and it was making me uneasy the more I thought about it. But then the guy suddenly told me to stop. He told me to pull over and drop him off here. I cautiously did as he said, pulling the car into the shoulder and parking. We were maybe 5 miles down the road from where I picked him up, and there was still nothing but dense forest all around. The guy quickly opened the door. Without saying anything, he started rushing away, heading for the trees. I was super weirded out and concerned about this whole thing, and at this point, I just wanted to get out of there, but he left the door open, and when I leaned into the back seat to shut it, I noticed a drawstring bag tucked under the passenger seat. It wasn't mine. It was definitely as I called out for the guy, and he turned around. "Hey, you left your bag." He stood with a straight face and wide, frustrated eyes staring at me for several uncomfortable seconds. Then he came back. "Your bag, you left it right here." I pointed under the seat, and he hesitated for another several seconds before grabbing at a bra. Up to lay in, turning around, hurrying back into the forest. I reached over and shut the door, then left the area as fast as I could. I was relieved to be away from that guy, knowing that something was definitely up with him. But it was only a few minutes down the road, and I started to pick up on an awful odor from the back seat. It got increasingly worse over the next 30 minutes, until I got into another small town. I stopped at a gas station and used my phone light to look into the back seat. On the carpet under the passenger seat right, where the drawstring back had been sitting, there was a deep red stain. I almost threw up as I ran into the gas station and called the police. I gave them all the info. I had on what happened, and they cut out the piece of carpet from my car to get tested. They also did a search for the man, but came up empty-handed, only finding a few footprints near the spot I picked him up at. I don't know exactly what was in that bag, but it seems like he was trying to plant it in my car as a means to cover something up. We still have no idea who he was or why he was up to that night. I was working a quick DoorDash shift on a Monday night. I got out of my day job at 7 and decided to make a few deliveries. It was a pretty regular, quiet night with nothing much to note. I delivered about 7 or 8 orders before I took my last one for the night. I drove it down to the house and dropped it off, then started heading back into town where my apartment was. It was around 10 o'clock now, and after that delivery I was about 20 minutes out in the farmlands as rounds or town. A couple minutes into my drive back, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down and the men moved over a little bit, but not enough to be out of my way. Once they got closer, he looked right at me and stuck his thumb out. In my headlights, I could tell he was an older guy, like early 50s, and he had a large backpack over his shoulders. Since I was already slowing down, I figured I'd be helpful and ask if he needed a ride into the city since I was heading that way anyways. He leaned on the windowsill and thanked me for stopping. His eyes looked heavy and exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, but he seemed nice enough, so I agreed to give him a ride. What I wasn't expecting, though, was for him to immediately open the passenger door and sit in the seat right next to me. Didn't really matter, I guess, but I felt like he was usually common courtesy to get in the back seat. As he got situated, I looked past 10 at where he came from. It was a field of tall grass, just a huge farm or something. You from around here, what brings you out to the farmland? He looked over at me, just making my way across the country to visit. My family don't have a car, so I've been hedging ride. I thought that was pretty interesting, so I asked more about where he was from, but he gave me very vague and uninterested answers. A couple times I caught him looking into my back seat, not just quick glances though, like he was running his eyes through the whole back seat and looking for something. Something about this guy started to make me feel off. He wasn't talking much, it was just acting really unusual. Is everything okay? I asked. I still had my eyes on the road, but he didn't say anything. So then I looked over at him. My eyes were drawn to his disturbing stare before I noticed the knife he had clenched in his right hand. Stop the car. I didn't say a word and parked right in the middle of the road. I was terrified and just thought if I let him take whatever he wanted, then I'd get out unharmed. So that's exactly what I was going to do. As soon as the car was in park, I turned to open my door, but he quickly stopped me. Get in the back, he demanded, still clenching the knife. I froze up for a moment, realizing we were in the middle of empty fields, and that if I get in the back, I'll probably never have another chance to escape. He told me a gun, and that's also when I noticed his large backpack was slightly open by his feet, revealing a thick bundle of rope. I had no choice but to try my luck escaping now before it was too late. I opened the door and jumped out of the car in one swift motion. The man tried jumping across the front seat to grab me, but I sprinted to the other side of the road and into the tall grass. I kept on running, through the field until I felt like he couldn't find me. Then I stood still and waited. He yelled a few times from the road, but then it went quiet. All I could hear was the wind blowing the grass around. I stood still and motionless for a good 15 minutes before I slowly made my way back toward the road. I looked through the grass and could see my headlights still beaming onto the pavement in the driver door, still open. The man was nowhere to be seen after scoping it out for another minute. I sprinted up and grabbed my phone, then ran back into the grass and called 911. I didn't know if he was still hiding somewhere waiting for me, so I didn't risk staying up there. Eventually the police showed up though. I couldn't believe the man didn't drive away my car. He must have just grabbed his backpack and run off into the other field, or maybe even tried chasing me through the grass and just didn't find me. Either way, he clearly showed that his intentions were not to just rob me of my belongings, which makes the scenario 100 times more disturbing. I gave the police a description of the man, but there still haven't been any sightings. Story 4. There's an abandoned hotel in my town that's been vacant for decades. It had been bought out several times before, but every time they ended up going bankrupt after just a few years. Our town is small and kind of old-fashioned, so there's really no reason for anyone to visit unless they have family here, which means that there's really no reason to even have a hotel as big as this one way. It was at least 6 stories and was probably the largest building in our town. Anyway, when I was 23, I just casually decided to check it out. I felt like there was nothing actually dangerous or scary about it. It was just an empty, abandoned building that would be cool to walk around and look at. I decided to go during the day because I figured that if anyone was there during the daytime, then they were probably just harmless people exploring it like me. I parked at a store that was a half-mile away, then walked to the hotel. It was mostly isolated on the side of the road, being that most of the store surrounding it had already been torn down. The hotel itself, though, looked a lot worse than the last time I'd seen it. The brick was crumbling and the whole place seems like he was fading and decaying. I went up to the front and glanced inside. It was mostly empty, with only a few things scattered around, like chairs and old furniture. I stepped in and walked through the lobby, opening the door to the staircase. The horse stairwell was covered in shadows as barely any light was getting in. All I could see was a dim beam of light coming from one of the floors above. It was only just enough for me to find my way up the stairs. But when I got to the door on the second story, it was blocked. Something on the other side was keeping it from opening, and a sheet of wood was covering the window on the door. I left it and continued up to the third story, opening the door and entering the hallway. This was probably the most creepy setting I'd ever been in. The hallway was dark and musty, with only a small window on either end to light up the corridor. I walked down a little bit, then went into the first room with an open door. Oddly, it looked kind of normal. There were layers of dust covering everything, but all the furniture was set up as if it had never been moved. There were even towels and so left in the bathroom still. As I was looking at all of this, I heard a small thump. I turned around and faced the doorway, not sure if that was from the floor I was on or the one below me. A few seconds later, quiet footsteps greet the floorboards coming down the hallway. As they got closer, I just stared at the doorway and hoped that they weren't on my floor. After a few seconds, though, I heard them stop followed by a door opening and then slamming shut on the floor below me. Afterward, there were no footsteps or really any sounds at all. I tried to be quiet, walking up to the hallway and looking out to make sure nobody else was here. Thinking about it, though, I couldn't see why another person, just exploring the place, would walk so deliberately to a room and slam the door. And the more I thought about it, the more nervous I got. Only adding to the Uranus was how silent the whole place was. And after a minute of standing in the hallway and thinking I'd had enough, I quietly walked back to the staircase and opened the door, entering the dark stairwell and starting to descend. There was no way to be quiet time the metal stairs. Each step was an unavoidable, although thump. But as I passed the door to the second story, I noticed a small gap in the doorway that definitely wasn't there before. Then I looked down at the stairs ahead of me. A figure stood in the stairwell, only a few steps below me, barely visible in the darkness, but their eyes stared right at me. They looked dreadful and emotionless. With no choice, I started, carefully walking on the edge of the staircase, passing by them, with only a couple feet between us, as his eyes followed every move I made. Once I got to the bottom, I opened the door and ran out into the lobby where I can finally see clearly. I hurried back to my car and sat in the parking lot for a while. Looking back, that was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I guess I just didn't realize when I was walking into... I'm not sure why that person was there, or what they were doing, but leaving when I did was probably the only good decision I made. Story 5. I was taking a few days off and spending it camping in the woods. I was in some for us the few hours from my town, and had set up camp at the end of a 4-hour trail. I'd spent the night there already. Had noticed this then path leading out from the campsite. I had no idea where it went. There wasn't on the map of the area. But having nothing better to do on that second day, I thought I'd go for a short hike down the path, just to see if the lead anywhere cool. Maybe a small pond or waterfall or something. I brought with me a backpack with food and water in case I'd be out longer than expected. Walking through the trail, it was very obvious that almost nobody used it, or at least hadn't used it in a long time, maybe even years. It was very thin and overgrown, and a lot of sections I didn't see any signs of people like hue prints or anything. This went on for several miles, taking around 2 hours before I found it, and there wasn't what I expected. There was a house or cabin sitting in the woods. At first sight, there was no mistaking that it was abandoned. Moss and vines were growing out of the woods siding, and the doors and windows were all open. Before approaching any further, I looked around and my surroundings, just checking for anything, as this wasn't a normal thing to just stumble across. The woods were calm and unsettlingly still. I went up to the doorway and poked my head in, looking down the front hallway. There was dust and debris lying all over the floors, but there was otherwise barren. I went in a little further. It smelled of mildew and rotting wood, but as I crept through the rooms, there wasn't much to see. Feeling uneasy, though I was about to turn around and leave, but a small glimmer caught the side of my eye. On one of the closed wooden doors, the handle had been ripped off and replaced by a silver padlock. It almost looked brand new and matched nothing else in the house. My curiosity immediately had me thinking of why there was a padlock on the door to an otherwise empty and ruined cabin. The more I looked at it, though, that uneasy feeling just took over me and I couldn't get myself to investigate. I quickly left the house and went back to the path. Just as I entered the trail again, I heard a single footstep on the wooden floor inside the house. I turned and looked at the doorway, but saw nothing, so I kept on walking, trying to distance myself from that place. As I walked back through for the whole 2 hours, I kept hearing footsteps in the distance, like someone was following me. The trees densely covered that area, though, making it impossible to see that far. When I got back to the camp, I got a fire going early and just sat and waited, listening and looking to see if anyone showed up. By nightfall, I hadn't heard anything else, but as the hours got later, I started hearing it again. Footsteps out in the distance, far beyond the light of the campfire, but definitely close enough for them to see the light. It went on for several hours, hearing a line of footsteps every 10 to 15 minutes. Still, though, I was never able to see them, and eventually it got so late that I knew I had to sleep. So I left the campfire going as I got inside my tent. I was in an hour of sleep for the rest of the night, waking up at every small sound the woods made. After getting almost no sleep, I laughed. What the cabin was doing there, and whoever had followed me that night, I'll never know. I can't say what they intended to do, but their disturbing stalking behavior only lets me assume the worst. But I can never seem to stop thinking about the disturbing possibilities of what was behind that locked door. Story 6. I was out camping in a familiar part of the forest near my city. My city is small and honestly has not much to do, so camping is the one thing I found that I really enjoyed doing. I'm not a big fan on hiking, though. I prefer the more relaxing aspects of camping, like sitting by a fire and having no responsibilities. The trail I went on was one I'd been to plenty of times. It was only a 30-ish minute walk from the parking area, and the campsite was right by a lake. Having only my small city near the forest, there's only so many people that could possibly be camping at the same time and place as I was by this time. When I got there, a man had a tent already set up. I could see him down by the lake walking in the sand. He looked like he was in his 40s. He had some generic swimming shorts on and a stained white t-shirt. I walked a little further from where his tent was then set up mine. I then collected some large stones from nearby and placed them in a ring, prepping for the campfire I was going to have later. As I did, I noticed the man looking at me. Not just like a glance, though. He was standing down by the lake with his body turned completely toward me and was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked back, he was in that same spot and still staring at me. He got really creepy, so I ended up waving at him to see if he was maybe wanting to say hi or something, but after I waved, he turned around and continued walking along the lake. Whatever that was, I didn't like it. He gave me an uncomfortable feeling about that guy, so I tried to keep an eye on him. For a while, nothing else really happened, but after 20 minutes, he walked away from the lake and into the forest behind his tent. I thought there might have been a trail back there, or he could have just been walking around, but whatever the case, I was just glad he was gone for now. I put my chair down by the lake and relaxed. I was down there for an hour or so before picking my chair back up and moving it back to my tent. The sun was setting, so I lit up my campfire. As I sat there and looked around at the forest, I suddenly spotted something. Far out there was a shape next to one of the trees. I squinted, trying to get a clearer view. All I could make out was what looked like a white shirt. It was that guy again, and he was just standing far behind my campsite and staring in my direction. Now this was getting really creepy. How long was he watching me for? I moved my chair to the other side of the campfire so that I was now facing him, just so I didn't lose sight of him. He stayed there for a good 30 or 40 minutes, watching me from far out in the forest before it started to get dark out. The shadows everywhere started making it hard to see him anymore, and after a while, I couldn't even make out his shape. I could only look in the general direction he was in. Yet with my campfire lighting up my sight, I knew he could still see me. Knowing he was still out there staring at me, yet not being able to see anything, I started getting really anxious. What the hell was this guy doing? He had a tent here like he was camping or in the hours that I'd been here. I never once saw him go to it. With everything getting to my head, I debated packing up and leaving, but at this point, I was worried the guy would follow me out. So I sat there and tended the fire, making sure it didn't go out, and I just waited. Several long, tiring hours passed, and I didn't see anything. He never came back to his tent, or came close enough for me to see him. When the sun started coming up, I looked all around and saw no signs of him. I packed up my gear and booked it back to my car. It's hard to know that guy's intentions. If I hadn't stayed awake and been cautious of him from the start, who knows where I'd be right now. Story 7. I go camping with my dad every summer. He's done it his whole life, and recently I've gotten into it as well. I'm 16, and last year my dad and I went out on our season or camping trip. We found this spot online together while looking for a new camping area to try out for the summer. There's no pictures of the area, but the map was easy to follow, and the description of the trail was that I was easy and uncrowded. We set out on Friday morning, parking on the side of the road and beginning down the trail. After the first quarter mile, it was clear that the description wasn't very accurate. It was pretty steep in some parts, and a lot of the trail was muddy or overgrown, which made it actually really hard. Already being there, though, we just pushed through and eventually got to the campsite. It looks no different than the woods on the trail that we had been walking on for the past 2 hours. There were trees everywhere, and just a plot of overgrown grass to set our stuff up on. No cool views or anything. We pitched our tents and made lunch. My dad was a bit of a talker, so the rest of the day we were just in conversation. Once the sun was starting to set, we walked around the trees near the campsite and collected some dry sticks to make a fire with. In the middle of us talking, though, we were interrupted by a loud voice behind us. We both stopped talking and spun around. The woods were suddenly quiet again, and we didn't see anyone there. It sounded not too far away, though, like maybe a mile out. Neither of us said anything for 30 seconds, just staring at the trees and trying to spot any movement. Then it came again. A man's voice yelling. It sent chills through me. There was a pain and harshness to the scream, like they were in trouble. I looked up, and my dad, who looked really conflicted and worried, he turned me around and led me back to the campsite, quickly starting the fire. The screams kept coming, though, and Eventually, I asked my dad if we should help them. I could tell my dad was thinking of every option. He faced me and told me to stay by the fire and wait. His face was serious, and he said he was going to run a little ways toward the voice and just see what he could see in that if I saw anyone, to not let them near me. I agreed and watched him run toward the man's voice. After a minute, he was out of sight. Honestly, I wasn't sure where I would have done if I were my dad's shoes. Leaving someone in need of serious help would make me feel horrible, but we were also in the middle of the woods. So if something happens while I don't know, after 10 minutes I started to get a little worried. The sun felt like it was dropping fast, and there was still no sign of my dad. But then suddenly the screaming stopped. The whole forest was now quiet again. I wondered if my dad had found him and was helping him, or if something else happened. Still, after another 10 minutes, my dad was nowhere in sight. With the blanket of darkness starting to cover the forest, I grew more and more nervous. I stood up and walked a little bit away from the campsite and toward where my dad had gone. There were still no signs of him, so I walked a little more, and then finally I heard footsteps from up ahead. I still couldn't see anything, but as the sound of his steps started getting closer and closer, an eerie, almost disturbing feeling came over me. Then, just before I thought they would come into my sight, a voice to my left called my name. It was my dad running toward me and yelling at me to go. Back there was urgency and worry in his voice. So I hurried to the campsite. My dad followed behind me. He quickly packed the essentials into his backpack. The look on my dad's face is something I still remember vividly. It was complete fear and distraught. We left the tents and ran for the first mile, then fast walked back to our car. On the drive home, I asked him what he saw out there, who the man was, and why he was screaming. My dad said nothing. Even to this day, he never brings it up or says anything of what he saw. Every time I so much as mention that day, his entire demeanor changes and his face falls flat, so I just stopped asking. All I can think about now is those footsteps that I heard walking toward me, and what would have happened if my dad hadn't shown up in time. Story 8. This was a few months ago while driving for DoorDash. I only drive as a side gig, maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. This night there was only doing a couple orders since it was already late, and I picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business building somewhere across town, which was apparent by the address. This was a normal thing, usually for overnight workers or whatever. When I pulled into the parking lot, though, it was empty. No cars at all, and it didn't look like there was a parking lot behind the building either. I parked in a spot near the front and got it with the food. The place was definitely an office building of some kind and was smaller than most, being only 2 stories and not very wide. All the lights were off in the windows, though aside from one light behind the front door. I walked up to the door and checked the app, seeing it has specific drop-off instructions to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside of room to 32. I looked through the door in the building, seeing this hallway with a bunch of closed doors on either side. Delivering to specific rooms I'd only done at hotels, so this was kind of new for me. I tested the door pushing on it, and there was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working, moving around, or talking, but instead didn't hear anything. There wasn't a single sound in the whole building. It was just white noise from the overhead lights buzzing above me. As I passed the first few doors, though they were all numbers in the 100s, like 102 and 106, The room the instructions said to leave it at was in the 200s, so I assumed that meant it was on the second floor. In the middle of the hallway was the doorway leading to the staircase. It was held open with a wedge, doorstop stopper on the floor, but the lights weren't on. I stepped in and up to the bottom of the staircase, then looked up. The whole stairwell was pitch black. Not even any light was coming from above where the room was supposed to be for me to drop it off. That again, I started to notice the eerie silence, and it sent a chill through me. I was always one to do whatever the instructions say so I'd get good reviews, but this was the first time. I told myself that this was too sketchy. I stepped out of the stairwell and back into the hallway, and just as I did, the door right across from me opened. The lights in that room were off, but a man emerged from behind the door and stepped into the hallway. He was wearing street clothes and just didn't look like an office worker at all. When he stood in front of me and pointed past me at the stairwell. 232 is up there. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just looked me in the eyes with a look like he was suppressing his anger. After an intense few seconds, I dropped the bag on the ground and started quickly walking to the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps go into the stairwell and up the stairs as I left the building. I got in my car and left. I didn't know what that was, or if I was maybe overreacting about it, so I didn't call the police. The following day, though, the police actually called me. Apparently the office reported a break-in in the CCTV footage. They saw my car and license plate tracking it back to me. They also had footage of the break-in, and so they called me in to question me about any information I might have. I didn't have much to go. Of what it turned out, there were actually 3 people that broke inside. One was downstairs, who I saw, but the other 2 were shown on the cameras to be hiding at the top of the stairs, seemingly waiting for me to go up. Disturbingly, several other delivery orders were made to that same office that night. All of the other drivers were smarter than I was, though, leaving the orders outside by the front door. What would have taken place in that office had any of us gone up to the second floor is unknown. But hopefully police can find the 3 men before anyone falls victim to it. Story 9. I'm a manager at a mid-sized grocery store. I do 10-hour shifts and work mostly overnights. At the time, our store was having some staff issues that made pretty much every department understaffed and over. Words in overnight stocking was no exception. I had one guy that would help me 5 nights a week, but that was it other than me. This was on his day off, so it was only me working. I got in at 10, it was alone by 10:15. After running some numbers in the office, I started pulling out loads of boxes. To the eye, chose to start unpacking and stocking. Even though I had no help this night, I still had to get everything done. So I was working hard and as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop for a break or anything. But suddenly a tapping sound echoed through the store. I stopped and listened, hearing it happen again, and it sounded just like someone tapping on a window at the front of the store. I looked at my watch for the first time since I started working, and there was time had flown by, but there was no reason anyone should be here. I walked down the aisle and to the front, where I quickly saw someone outside the store. He was leaning against the window and trying to look inside. He spotted me as I walked up and stared at me. When I was just on the other side, I asked what he wanted. The man, looking like he was homeless, told me to open the door. He had a straight face, no smile or anything. I said we were closed and he couldn't be here, then turned to walk away, but the man immediately banged on the window. Not tapping like he was before, this was now harsh banging. I looked back at him and he was clearly enraged with his fist against the glass. Thinking this guy was crazy, I told him I'd call the cops. If he doesn't leave, then started pulling my phone out to show I was serious. And only then did he step away from the window. He still had that angry work as he walked away and into the parking lot. Seeing him leave, I put my phone away and got back to work. We get a lot of crazy customers around here, so I didn't think on it too much. And again, I had to focus on getting my work done. I was only able to get a small cart of boxes start, so it was maybe 15 minutes later when a sudden sound echoed through the store. Yeah, it sounded like something metal snapping or scraping. I quickly dropped what I was doing and ran up to the front. Nobody was at the windows, so I went up to the entrance door. It was one of those revolving glass doors, which uses a boat lock on the top to keep it from opening. When we closed the store for the night, right away I saw that bolt was missing, like not even just unlocked, the entire bolt was gone. I pressed my hand on the door and it glided around completely, allowing anyone to get in. I could feel my face turn white as I realized what this meant, and I knew I needed to call the police immediately. I turned around to go to the front office, or was instantly looking into the face of that guy from before. He was only a few feet from me, still having that enraged stare. I didn't hesitate to run out the revolving door, hearing the guy follow close behind me. As I ran out into the parking lot and all the van came speeding up to the front, it nearly hit me, but I just kept running until I got to my car. When I rushed in, I noticed the guy wasn't chasing me anymore, and the van was now speeding out of the parking lot. I called the cops and spent the next couple hours explaining what happened. It wasn't until the next day that we got security footage of the men breaking inside, but it wasn't the best image quality. We can say almost for sure that they were trying to get me into their van, but we have no way to know why. I'm sure if I'd not been as quick, though, I probably wouldn't have ever been seen again. Story 10. My name is Caleb Fletcher. I'm 16 years old, and this took place around 89 months ago on the 24th of August, which was a Saturday. School had been going on for about 2 weeks, so to distress a little, I decided to see if my friends, while Call, Griffin, and Rowley, wanted to hop on Fortnite. My mom and sister were out shopping. My dad was working, and I was bored. It was around 8 p.m. when we finally got on the play, because I decided to make pizza rolls beforehand and ended up burning the batch. After a few rounds, I could tell my friends were getting tired of losing, so they got off after only an hour. I planned on just lying down with my phone and going to bed. That was until I heard my 2 dogs barking outside. It's not unusual for them to bark given how people typically walk on the side of the road, but I still looked anyway just to make sure. I didn't see anybody, but seconds after looking out the window, I heard our garage door open and shut. That usually means my dad is home from work, but I didn't see his van outside, and he had texted me earlier telling me that he would be working late tonight. I decided to walk downstairs into the dining room and look out the window to get a better view. From there I could see that our driveway was empty. There wasn't a person or vehicle in sight. I wasn't the type to go investigate, so I ran back up to my bedroom. It takes in my family group chat to ask if anybody was home. I told my mom about the garage door and she told me to turn off the lights, lock my bedroom, and stay there until she got home. So I did just that. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard our wooden floor downstairs creaking like someone was trying to be sneaky. I didn't have anything to use as a weapon, so I unclipped my microphone's boom arm from my desk and quietly opened the door. I walked out onto our upstairs balcony and looked over, trying to see if I could spot anyone hiding or anything suspicious. I stupidly yelled, "Is anybody there?" Like they were really going to answer. I thought everything was fine though, until I saw a large silhouette of someone standing underneath the balcony. I panicked and ran to the closest room, with a door which happened to be my small bathroom. The intruder must have known. I noticed them because I heard loud and fast footsteps running up our stairs as I locked myself in the bathroom. I had stupidly left my phone in the bedroom, which was the room right next to me. After I built up enough courage, I bolted into my bedroom, locking the door as soon as I got in. My sister's room was right across from mine and its door was open, so I figured the intruder must have been in there. After locking my bedroom door, I grabbed my phone and typed 911 into it. Just before I called, I noticed that the storage room in my wall was open just a tad. I saw a dark brown eye peeking through the crevice, staring into my soul. The pure terror I felt in that moment is something I'll never forget. Had booked it down the stairs and out my front door, running up the hill to my neighbor's house. He was a police officer. He alerted the other cops while I stayed with his wife, and he went down to investigate. I told him exactly where the intruder was hiding in my bedroom. Minutes later, I ran back down the hill to see if the intruder I've been caught. When I walked in, I saw a tall, skinny man with the gray beard and a dirty black coat being pushed onto the floor by my neighbor as he was getting handcuffed. I'm not allowed to be home alone anymore, and we have better security around our house. Now my family was just happy to know I wasn't hurt, and they were thankful for my neighbor's bravery. I don't wish an experience like this on anybody, not even my worst enemy. Story 11. I was with my college friends. Is doing the weekend camping trip in the woods near us. I'll use different names for their privacy, so I'll call them Ryan and Jamie. Ryan and I aren't experienced in outdoor activities, so it was Jamie leading us through it all. He had a small spot by the river that he led us to. It was a couple miles through the woods, but there was a huge field just on the edge of the river that we would set up combat. When we got there, nobody else was there. We set everything up right in the middle of the field between the woods and the river, then brought out the beers and sat around the campfire. A little while after getting there, I happened to see some people out by the tree line. They looked like hunters, having dirty clothes and backpacks, like they were blending into the woods, but I didn't see any rifles. They were pretty far though, so maybe I just couldn't see them. I pointed them out to my friends, but Jamie had a puzzled look. He said hunting in these woods was illegal and it wasn't even hunting season anyway. He seemed really concerned that they were out here. Ryan joked that he was taking it too seriously, and we went back to our random conversations. A few more hours later, we agreed to call it a night. The sun had been down for a while at this point, and the high could really worn us out. We all went into our tents by not being used to it. I found it really hard to fall asleep. So something about being out in the open in a tiny tent and laying on a thin blow-up mattress just had me feeling off. I must have laid there for a whole 2 hours, and at that point I was just hoping I could at least get a few hours of sleep. But then something instantly made me wide awake. Footsteps coming toward our tents. At first I thought I had to be Ryan or Jamie, probably coming back from using the bathroom, but I swear I would have heard them unzipping their tent and walking out. Only a few seconds later, though, I realized there were more than just one set of footsteps. There were 2 or 3 maybe, even more, all walking in a line. I looked at the thin wall of my tent thinking I should be able to see their lights coming toward us, but there weren't any lights at all. Surely whoever was out there had to have seen our tents, up in the middle of an open field, and nobody in their right mind would just walk past us like this. I didn't know what to do, though. I just pretended to be asleep, quietly listening to them getting closer. The line of people came probably just a few feet from us, walking right past our tents. As soon as they were far enough away, I quietly unzipped my tent and looked out. Just when I did, Ryan unzipped his tent. We both looked at each other with alarmed faces, then looked out at the group. They were barely visible, but definitely still walking away. I slipped out of my tent and opened. Jamie's waking him up. Both of us explained what happened, and surprisingly, he seemed even more horrified than either of us, likely because he'd been camping plenty of times and knew how odd this was. We started packing up our stuff, feeling way too uneasy to stay the rest of the night. While packing, Jamie suddenly told us with a shaky voice to hurry. We looked up at him, then followed his gaze. In the tree line, the group of what now looks like 5 or 6 people were standing in, looking over at us. My adrenaline was pumping now, and I shoved everything into my bag, and we all sprinted for the trail. We left our lights off, to hopefully not be seen. So the rest of the walk, we were barely able to see anything. Luckily we made it back, but what that group is doing out there is unknown. Based on everything, though, I don't think our encounter with them was any sort of accident.